Executive Director, Policy Group. On behalf of our board and our staff and our co-organizer today, the UNDP in Washington, we are thrilled to have you with us. The WFPG for almost 30 years has empowered and advanced women's participation in international affairs through our global policy programming, our robust mentorship programs, and our high-level networking with leading women foreign policy experts and practitioners. If you are not already a member, please do consider joining our over 750 strong membership. We have a great calendar of events ahead in 2024 and look forward to welcoming you to them. I'd like to thank our partner today, the UNDP and its Washington office, led by the great Don Gressett. This is not our first collaboration together with the UNDP in Washington, and we certainly hope it's not our last. We love working with you. Thank you to our esteemed speaker. We are so grateful to have you with us today, Francine Pickup, the UNDP's Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Director, Bureau for Policy and Program Support, and to our skilled moderator, Alia Dharssi. We have a vibrant conversation ahead this morning. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our featured speaker. Alia Dharssi is a journalist based in Vancouver. Her work focuses on sustainability, global development, human rights, and immigration, and she's been published in a range of media outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, The National Post, The Financial Post, and Reuters. She is also deputy editor of Asparagus, a magazine that tells the small and large stories of how we can live sustainably. Thank you, Alia, for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I'm so excited to be here today and to be hosting this conversation with Francine Pickup. Francine Pickup serves as the Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Director of the Bureau of Policy and Programming at the UNDP. Prior to her current post in New York, she had leadership roles at UNDP offices in India, Serbia, and Indonesia. Francine has been with the UN since 2002, and she's worked in the Middle East and across Asia. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Cambridge and a PhD and master's in development studies from the London School of Economics. So those are just a few highlights from her resume, which is, very long. There's many accomplishments, but I'm looking forward to getting into the chat today. So before we get into the discussion, just a note, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So as you come up with questions that you'd like to ask Francine towards the end when we have the Q&A period, please go ahead and post your questions there, and we'll do our best to get through them. So, Francine, I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation with you and to learn from you about today's global development challenges and, where can we go from the current circumstances and crises that we're facing, from climate change to conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine, and, many more conflicts around the world that are not as well covered by the media. So let's start this discussion by chatting about the big picture. 2024 is off to a rocky start. Could you give us a big picture readout on how you see the context for development work this year?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome, Alexa. It's really good to be invited and sharing with this Women's Foreign Policy Group. I'm excited about this conversation, and thank you, Alia, for the very nice welcome. So 2024. I think we're really in an unprecedented moment. Last year we saw that we marked the sort of halfway point to 2030 and the SDGs. And we've also seen, as we're coming out of COVID finally, that human development has really been hit hard with last year, the second successive year where the Human Development Index saw a regression that's unprecedented since the Human Development Index began. And so if we look to 2024 and the start of this year, you know, there's a lot at stake, and we're starting in a very troubled situation. If you look purely at the economic situation, we're now moving into our third year of economic downturn, with the economic growth a full 1 percentage point below what it was in the 20 years pre-COVID at 2.5%. And then if you look at the interest rates, I mean, there's some good news. It looks like European and countries in the US may relax the high interest rates, which will ease the burden on debt payments and allow countries to invest more in energy transition and in infrastructure. But still, we are seeing that while some countries, particularly richer countries, are able to recover from the COVID pandemic, there's a large group of developing countries, what we call LDCs or less developed countries, that are really stuck. They're facing permanent losses in human development, whether it be to health, to education, to poverty. And they're stuck in debt with very high interest rates on loans that they need to pay. Sometimes 20% of their GDP is just going to loan repayments, which means that they're unable to invest in development and in the social sectors that are so critical at this time. And then if you really, you know, go beyond just the economic numbers and what they say, the general trajectory of growth that we see is not the growth that we want. The growth that people want is not the growth that we're getting. The growth that we're getting is debt-driven, it's carbon intensive. So even though there is some growth, it hasn't stopped poverty numbers going up in a third of the countries that UNDP has worked with last year on these global SDG insights reports. And in 2/3 of the countries, it's involved increasing carbon emissions. So the growth trajectory that we're getting is not going to get us towards the SDGs and to the Paris Agreement. And then you mentioned in your introduction the conflicts that we're seeing. So the conflicts that we're seeing are having immeasurable toll from a humanitarian perspective, but also from a development perspective as well. We saw with the conflict in Ukraine, the impact that this has had not only in Ukraine itself, but around the world in terms of the disruption to food systems and global supply chains. And now, you know, with the conflict in Gaza, I mean, the humanitarian toll is unimaginable, really. But the development toll, it's taken the country back, it's taken Palestine back decades. And then we've also come out with important findings in the last few weeks, that the impact isn't restricted to Israel-Palestine, that beyond in the neighboring countries, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan, these countries have lost apparently approximately 10 billion or over 2% of their GDP just as a result of this conflict. So conflict is adding to the economic impact, and people's sense of insecurity is growing. So research that we came out with recently as UNDP showed that it doesn't matter whether you're living in a rich country or a poor country, people feel insecure. 6 out of 7 people around the world reported feeling insecure. So even though we're living longer, healthier, wealthier lives than ever before in any time, people feel insecure. And that insecurity leads to fear, it leads to polarization, it leads to inequality. And and that just breeds potentially more conflict. So in that context, which can feel quite daunting, the SDGs really are so precious because they're our goal, they're our pathway forward to work together to address some of these challenges like climate that you can't address alone. We have to come together.
Okay, so clearly there's a lot of complex challenges right now, and it can almost make one sometimes feel pessimistic about, how are we going to deal with all of these social, economic, and environmental problems that people are facing around the world. So what do you see as the role of the UNDP and other UN agencies in responding to these challenges that we're facing today, and how are you navigating these problems?
So I think, you're right, these challenges can feel daunting, but it's really important to have a sense of hope and feel that things can be done. And why I like working in my organization is because we can always look for solutions and ways forward working in partnership with others. And I think this is a really important moment for multilateralism, and it's getting a bit of a beating, but we really have to pull together. And there are some really important moments coming up just this year. So, as UNDP, we work very closely with the G20, with the G7. These are really important groups, groupings of countries that can make change. So the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres came out recently with the SDG stimulus plan. This is really about how we can really mobilize sustainable finance to support development. And part of that is about how we can really support countries that are really stuck in indebtedness and are unable to invest in SDGs because they have such high loan repayments. It's about injecting more liquidity into the economy and societies. And it's about restructuring the international financial system. So it's really investing in the future, in green growth and in inclusive, sustainable growth. So that work is ongoing and is really important. And then if we look to some other key events coming up this year, we have the Summit of the Future, which is tied to the General Assembly that happens in September. Last year, we had the SDG Summit, and now we move into the Summit of the Future. And that's really going to be an important moment to galvanize and bring member states together to see how we can really form effective global cooperation around some of these, big challenges now and for the future. And then finally, I would mention, Alia, the upcoming COPs. So we had in Dubai at the end of the last year, COP28. This was a really important COP. It was the first global stock take, a report card, if you like, on where the world is in terms of reaching the Paris Agreement. And there's a very big gap. There's an awful lot to do. But also out of that COP, we saw, there was a lot of discussion about whether we could talk about phasing out fossil fuels. In the end, the language transitioning away was used, transitioning away from coal, oil, and gas. And that COP also sort of agreed to operationalize this loss and damage fund, which is about, supporting with financing those countries that are facing the biggest brunt, those developing countries that are facing the biggest impacts of climate change. And that climate finance discussion is a key discussion and will be the focus of the upcoming COP this year, COP29 in Baku. and then moving on into the COP30, which will be next year, which will be about, again, making sure that countries can, again, lift their ambition in their nationally determined contributions so that we can get to those climate targets of the Paris Agreement. So all in all, I would say it's a really important year for multilateralism and global action. And if we can sort of converge around these global priorities rather than diverge, I think it's going to be really, really important.
So when it comes to multilateral cooperation, I do get a sense of pessimism out there. I spend a lot of time kind of talking to folks in the climate action space, and people are concerned that, you know, COP is not doing enough. It's moving too slowly. We saw a lot of oil companies, you know, an increasing number at recent COPs that has raised concerns. So how would you respond to kind of this idea that, you know, multilateral cooperation isn't working or it's not moving fast enough?
So I think, you know, if we continue with the example of the climate space, and absolutely there was a lot of discussion and speculation around the COP in Dubai. I think for UNDP, our strength is at the country level. We have a network of offices all around the world, and we've been working. Most of my experience is at the country level too. And, you know, we have trust given to us by different partners, governments, but also civil society. Increasingly, we work with the private sector. And we're really there to support countries in getting things done. And so when discussions are so fraught and the agenda is so divided, our approach is to support those developing countries to get the job done. And so very concretely, we support, and in the lead up to these COPs, we support countries in defining their ambition. So, for example, when I was in Serbia, just before I moved to my current role, we worked extraordinarily hard to support that country in coming up with its nationally determined contributions that would then be submitted and presented to the COP. Then we also work on helping the countries to really operationalize those ambitions. So how do you turn those into plans? How do you finance those plans? How do you work across government? Because it's not just the environment ministries that have to work on this. It involves the finance ministries, involves, you know, other ministries that work on other issues, trade, infrastructure, economy. So how do you work across the whole of government to really deliver on that climate ambition? How do you support access to energy, clean energy? How do you support transition to a greener form of growth that is less reliant on fossil fuels? These are the kinds of questions that we focus on to really help support those global processes to achieve, you know, the results that they need. So we actually worked with 120 countries on their nationally determined contributions. We call it our climate promise, so that, you know, so that Glasgow was actually a success, and that the countries can continue now to implement those ambitions and continue to raise those ambitions.
I think that's a really important point, that there is a lot of things kind of happening in the background, and we don't always see this kind of work in the headlines. You know, when we're following what's happening at COP or kind of other UN events. Now, one thing that you mentioned to me before is how you are passionate about big picture change. A lot of people, when they look at the UNDP, maybe they associate it with specific projects, but these are all kind of coming together at the country level. Can you tell me more about how that works?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, typically, as you say, when you think of UNDP, you think of an organization that has lots of projects. I think we have, you know, across the organization over 3,500 projects, something like that. But increasingly, and in our current strategic plan, the focus is precisely on addressing those big issues that I outlined at the beginning. How do we address, you know, these big complex issues? And so we increasingly, and get that scale of ambition and acceleration that we need to address the SDGs, given where we're at right now in the world. And so we talk a lot about system transformation, which is a big word, but essentially what it means is we're moving beyond projects and a projectized approach that, you know, zeroes in on one specific issue and addressing it in a particular way. And we're looking increasingly at how you bring systems change. So this involves identifying much bigger, more complex goals and aspirations, higher level of ambition, and looking at how we can leverage the partnerships of those around us, often not the typical usual kind of partnerships, to really deliver that. And we use what we call dynamic form of management, which is really, rather than having a linear process for achieving a project, it's really constantly reviewing and understanding the situation in that context to identify what are the entry points for change and how can we accelerate that. So it's constant course correction and adaptation as the situation changes. So that's the portfolio approach. We've now, you know, rolled that out in around 50 different country offices. And our partners, whether it be government or other partners, like it because it's addressing their issues, it's addressing the big challenges that they face in how to work in a more integrated way. And it has higher level impact. So this is one thing that we're doing, and we're really re-examining our internal policies and procedures, essentially our business process as an organization, so that we can now have this sort of systems portfolio approach sit alongside the project approach as our actual sort of ways of working. But I would, my second kind of part, a sort of answer to your question, Alia, would be that we as an organization have focused on 4 big high-level targets. And we've set ourselves really big targets, knowing that they're going to be really, really tough to achieve, but as a way to galvanize the organization and, you know, and ensure that we work in partnership with others. We call these moonshots, but, you know, they're essentially very ambitious goals around energy. So, you know, 500 million people will have access to clean, affordable energy by 2025. That's so important for alleviating poverty as well. Then on poverty, 100 million we want to support lifting out of multidimensional poverty. Then on elections, we hope to support 800 million people go out to vote. This year is a bumper elections year around the world. There are going to be over 70 countries where more than 2 billion people are going to vote. And elections are an important part of that democracy, but we know that elections alone are not enough, and it's important and increasingly important that we look at broader governance issues beyond elections, so that you have, you know, an open and inclusive public space, effective institutions that deliver services to people. But elections is a really important part of that. And then final big moonshot is around sustainable finance. So there is plenty of money in the world to achieve the SDGs. Money is not the problem. You know, it's estimated that we need 3 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs. The money is there. The question is, how do we align all the money that's there with the SDGs and with those priorities? So we have a goal which is around mobilizing 1 trillion for the SDGs, and we have specific tools and ways we work with public and private institutions to help make that happen.
Hearing you talk about those moonshot goals makes me feel very hopeful. Now, in terms of, kind of translating that to your work in 2024, what are you placing priority on to work towards these kind of bigger picture ambitions?
Yeah, so I think this really is the priority, how we achieve these, these 4 priorities on these issues, as I said. I think we're looking at, what are some of the best ways to accelerate the achievement of these moonshots. So I can give you a taste, an example of a couple of what we call the accelerators to help us achieve these moonshots by the end of next year, actually. So one is digitization. We know that digital technology is developing so fast, and it can accelerate, but it can also do harm, right? And so we're increasingly looking also at the governance of the digital space. But if I can give you one example from my country experience, and that would be in India. And I look at a project that is probably one of the largest projects across UNDP in terms of scale and size, where we basically rolled out with the government an electronic vaccination system, where we were basically using an app to arm health workers at the last mile in the most remote villages around India with the tool to basically monitor vaccination availability and storage. And this was a tool that was rolled out across the country and eventually financed by the government, so completely sustainable and taken on by the government. And that was basically helping a country the size of India to manage its vaccine stocks, across the country. And then when COVID hit, having that digital system in place allowed the government to quickly pivot and use that tool to also manage the COVID vaccine as well. And that tool it was using, it shared that experience with other countries. I remember with Malawi, with Indonesia, with a number of others. So there was the South-South learning and cooperation angle to it. So that's just one example of how digital tools can really increase efficiency, save lots of money in the health sector, but also make sure that we reach the furthest first, that we leave no one behind. Another accelerator that I would talk about is finance. I mean, finance is critical for achieving all of our priorities and goals around the SDGs. And I'd like to give you another sort of very concrete example from my own experience, which is just unlocking Islamic finance in a country, in this case, it was Indonesia. There, it's a lovely sort of scenario because Indonesia is tagged as the most generous country in the world, actually, because a large majority of the population is Muslim and donates what they call zakat, which is like 2.5% of their income. It's associated with Sharia. It's a fundamental pillar of Islam. And we brokered a partnership with the state zakat organization in Indonesia, Basnas, so that these funds, which went into the billions, I mean, zakat is worth a lot of money, but isn't necessarily being channeled towards the SDGs. So we brokered, I think it's the first ever agreement with a zakat organization around the SDGs in Indonesia. And those funds were used to pay for access to energy projects, access to clean energy projects in remote parts of the country. and the scope for partnering with Zakat organizations who were so proud that this money, this donation from people was being used, and they could show the impact that it was having. The scope is huge. And also, we supported the government, the Ministry of Finance, to issue its first ever sovereign green Islamic bond. It's called a Sukuk. And again, that's another very good example, because through the issuance of that Islamic bond, the government was able to attract new sources of finance from the green space, from the Islamic finance space, new markets, to invest in green transition and green projects. While I was in Indonesia, the first issuance happened of 1.25 billion. But since then, there have been several further issuances of that bond, which I think is getting better and better. So, I mean, this is just one country, but you can see the potential that exists of unlocking finance, and the big change it can make to the big acceleration it can do to achieving the SDGs, if we can work with these partners in the private sector, amongst banks, but also, you know, these Islamic finance organizations too.
It's really interesting, those examples, in terms of kind of like the knock-on effect, and also the role that the UNDP seems to have played as like a facilitator and a connector to kind of bring the people together. So now, kind of on that note of partnerships, I imagine most of our audience here today is from the US. So how do you see the UNDP working with the United States and partnering with it?
Yeah, so I'm actually here in Washington this week. I mean, because, and this is, I think, my second visit since I've been in this role, because it is a very important partnership to us. I think we've been partnering with the US for decades, since the 1960s. And the US is a very important contributor to our core work. They provide core funds to our operation, and to our non-core work, to projects. So we have collaboration that is across all regions of the world, and pretty much across all issues. So everything from climate change right through to governance and rule of law. We work a lot together in crisis contexts, poverty, increasingly issues around financial integrity, information integrity. So a lot of collaboration in a broad range of issues. And I think it's important for audience from the US to really understand that this also helps the US in its, you know, in terms of security, in terms of democracy. It kind of pays back. And there's also a return on investment, because a lot of the procurement that we do is we're a $5 billion organization a year, but a lot of the procurement happens with US companies and firms as well. So there is a return on investment. But so the relationship is strategic and it's important. And actually what I'm here for this week is for discussions around the issue of localization. So it's really about how we can strategically partner together much more effectively to build capacity at the subnational level for community-based organizations, indigenous groups, women's organizations, to really be empowered and lead on their development. That's a key core priority now of USAID, and it's also an area where UNDP has a lot of strengths.
Another issue that I'd like to touch on is gender equality. So we just talked about a lot of difficult challenges that countries around the world are facing. How are these affecting gender equality, and how is the UNDP kind of working on these challenges in relation to gender?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, this is an issue I feel really passionately about as well. But if we look at SDG 5, the goal around gender equality, it's not in a good place. We're very far from achieving this goal. And not long ago, in the last few months, we issued a gender norms index, gender social norms index, which actually showed that sort of biases against women haven't got any less in the last 10 years. So, people, women and men around the world still think that still hold, and I think 9 out of 10 people still hold biases against women around the world. Everything from, men are better political leaders, men make better business executives. It's okay, 25%. It's okay for a man to beat his wife. These kinds of biases remain dominant. And we're also very concerned because we do see, as part of this polarization in the world, that there is a backlash against women, and there's a backlash against gender equality, the idea that women should be equal to men, and to women's rights. So this is something that we're working on very actively, together with our sister agencies, UN Women and others, to fight this backlash. And I think there are some critical things that we can do in this space. One is just better understanding and seeing a backlash when it happens. So we launched, for example, this, the use of this AI tool to really monitor social media, to be able to identify quickly when hate speech is starting, and we've rolled out that tool in several countries now, and it's really part of our sort of strengthening of our understanding around this backlash and having the evidence that it exists. A second important priority, I would say, is just to work very closely with women's organizations, community-based organizations. And I mean, I think across over 108 of the countries where UNDP works, we are working with feminist organizations, we're working with women's organizations to really boost their capacity to advocacy and to understand what's going on. And then the third thing I think that's really important is to build the capacity of governments, including women's ministries, but not only, to fight back as well, and to put regulations and protections in place to push back on this backlash. So we have, for example, what we call the Gender Equality Seal. It's something that all our country officers have gone through. It's a process for making sure that we have the right policies and procedures and practices in place so that we are a gender equal, gender sensitive organization. And we offer this as a kind of like an award to other institutions as well. We do it with private companies, we do it with public institutions. And so we've already rolled it out with over 100 different public institutions. So they have more capacity to see this backlash when it's happening and to know how to act on it. But, again, I'll give you an example more concretely from my time again in Serbia. So, when I was there, the Me Too campaign was in full swing in countries like the US, but it was pretty silent in Serbia. And then, we at the time were really working on campaigning around gender-based violence. We were using the 16 days of activism to really, communicate and campaign broadly to change gender norms in the country. And then, some young women probably over a year after the Me Too campaign was in full swing in countries like the US, some young women, girls, spoke out about some incidents of violence and abuse in a drama school in Serbia, and that really kick-started a bigger movement across Serbia. And we latched, because of the work that we'd been doing around outreach on gender violence, gender-based violence, we were able to integrate with that and really support that movement, help giving bigger voice to some of these women's organizations, working with men and really, amplifying their voices, working with the government as well. They were part of the campaign. We had some very strong women leaders in Serbia who were pushing this agenda too, to really, challenge these very prevalent social norms around unequal relations.
Yeah, this is both heavy, but kind of there is, it's great to hear about what you're doing to counter this kind of backlash to gender equality. So we're getting close to the time for questions from the audience. So I'll just ask one last question before we get to those. And that is, what kind of advice do you have for women beginning careers in foreign policy?
Well, I would encourage those of you listening in the audience to really do everything you can for multilateralism. If you believe that there are, the UN's not perfect, but it's one venue where countries can come together to try and sort out their differences and work together to come up with solutions to some of these big challenges that we face today that cannot be solved in individual countries alone, right? Climate change, conflict, issues around digital, gender inequality, all the SDGs actually, they require us to come together and to collaborate to achieve them. And so I think that this is important. I think you should follow what you're passionate about. I started out being passionate and worked on issues around gender-based violence. That's where I started my career. I worked in NGOs initially, Oxfam and Amnesty, and made a deliberate decision actually that I felt I could make more change, not being in an NGO, but being in the UN, where I felt it was possible to get higher level change. So I made that deliberate decision, and I also felt that it was important not just to work on gender and women specifically, but to look at the whole of development. So I think find that thing that you feel really passionately about and follow that, and that will be important. My other piece of advice would be to go to the field, not to stay in HQ, but to spend as much time in different countries, as close to communities as you can, because that's where you really learn. And I am constantly drawing back. In my job here in HQ, I am drawing back on that experience in countries to inform the decisions that I take. For me, I decided to take this job in HQ as opposed to working, as a leader in country offices, because I felt like I wanted to do system change. I'm interested in how, to be part of an effort to change a big organization, let's face it, a bureaucracy, so it can really be agile and respond to those needs on the ground. For me, it's about changing power imbalances within societies and why I moved from the country office to HQ is to address that issue and help the organization do that better at the corporate level. That's a little bit my journey, but happy to give any more advice that anybody needs, if I can.
Thank you, Francine. So we actually have a question very much related to what you were just saying about careers. And this question is from Hannah. Hannah is asking, do you think achieving the SDGs is possible without public-private partnerships? And do you see corporate diplomacy as a growing industry that young people should continue to explore?
Mm-hmm. So I think the short answer to your question, Hannah, is no. I don't think we can do it without that public-private partnership. You know, we really need the private sector on board. I think the private sector is the main sort of engine of development in countries. And so the private sector needs to be part of our effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And increasingly, we are working with the private sector on that. I can reel off a few examples of initiatives where we engage with the private sector. We work with the private sector on business and human rights. We work with the private sector on helping them to measure the impact of their investments in the SDGs. We work increasingly, I mean, if you look at just the issue of energy transition, it can't be done without those technology companies that can bring, you know, solar-powered mini-grids to Africa, or, you know, smart health centers to sub-Saharan Africa where people don't have access to energy. So working with the private sector, I would say, is fundamental to us achieving the SDGs.
Thank you. We have one other career-related question, and that is, as you mentioned earlier, it is important to sustain hope in this line of work. I was wondering what you do personally when you need to bolster your hopefulness and persevere with your work.
That's a good question. And it's a really pertinent question, because I have to say I started this year really struggling with that. You know, where do I find the hope? And I think, you know, I've turned 50. I'm over 50 now, and I think, you know, I have a number of strategies up my sleeve with all my years to kind of keep that hope alive. I think it's really important. There's no point in us being in this business if we don't have hope. It's important to be able to think about solutions. I mean, some things that I do just, you know, to try and keep balanced and to be useful and good at my job. I have a good work-life balance. I think that's really important. I have 3 teenagers now, so they're a little bit older and independent, but you know, I carve out time for myself, and for me, it's sports. So running and tennis, I am relying a lot on to keep my sanity these days. So I think that's important. But you know, I think for me, as I said at the beginning, the great thing about working for UNDP is that it is an organization that has those trusted partnerships with others, including governments, but much broader than that, at the country level. And we are, you know, we draw on our global policy network, this sort of network of hundreds and hundreds of experts around the world, to provide some solutions. And if we don't have the solutions, we bring people together to work out the solutions together. And so it's that that brings the hope for me, is that, you know, we are doing stuff and we're doing it on the ground, and we're doing it with partners, and we have this high level of trust given to us, afforded to us, to get things done, and to make a difference. And that's what I have to hold on to. You know, yeah, that's what I hold on to.
Thank you, Francine. And if I may say, I kind of feel like just having this conversation with you has increased my hopefulness this morning. So that's another source of hope. So we have another question on public-private financing, and this is from Aviva. And Aviva asks, what are the biggest challenges for public-private partnership financing, and what do you see as the solutions?
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, there are two main challenges around partnering with the private sector. The first is just around value and profit, right? I think moving beyond short-term profits and investing in sustainability and investing in the long term. I think, you know, that's one issue. You know, one of the problems is that currently, for example, we simply don't value nature. There is no price to nature. Nature is free and it's overexploited. We need to start, you know, valuing these invisible parts of, you know, of nature, or the emissions that we let out, and put a price to that. So these resources, these natural resources, aren't exploited without consequence. This is what we're talking about when we launched our human development report around the Anthropocene. We, as people now, are defining the future of the planet and are controlling our natural systems, determining the fate of our natural systems, and we are destroying them. So we have to change that. And so, you know, when we talk about economic growth and when we talk about profits, we need to start incorporating the value and the cost and the price of nature and climate and all these things. I think that's the broader issue. But then I think the second issue that we are up against as an organization is this risk of what everyone calls greenwashing, right? So it's really important when we work with the private sector that there are kind of transparent, rigorous tools for monitoring, measuring, overseeing contribution and impact towards green sustainable development goals, right? So I think that's, you know, that's a second kind of chunk of issues that are really important. So we are doing a number of things on that front, but for example, we have a tool called SDG Impact, which is basically helping companies to measure the impact of their investments on SDGs in practice. We're also launching now a sort of carbon markets high integrity program, which is really about making sure that you know, carbon credits and so on are solid and actual, you know, avoided emissions. So these are the kinds of initiatives I think that can prevent the risks of greenwashing that you have when you engage with the private sector.
So we have time for one more question before we wrap up. So this question is from Caroline. Caroline is asking, I was wondering if there are concerns that partnerships between the UNDP and more developed countries will be impacted negatively as these countries are experiencing various levels of democratic backsliding.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's another big question. And I think, I talked at the beginning about the challenges to multilateralism that we're seeing right now. We talked about at the start, rising sense of insecurity and how that feeds polarization, inequality, populism, fear, and we actually see, I think, on the multilateral stage, increasing divide between rich and poorer countries. And I think, even with COVID and the financial difficulties that countries, experienced as a result of COVID, has led countries to become a little bit more insular. So we really, multilateralism needs a lot of support and needs a boost. And, that also impacts on funding to development organizations. The funding situation for UNDP is very difficult, and some development and some countries, some of the rich countries have cut their funding to UNDP because of financial constraints at home. But I think our point would be that in order to address those big challenges of today, we really do need to come together, and we do need to invest in these big areas, the SDGs, climate, governance, poverty, energy. Developing countries, can't be expected to finance alone all the impacts of the climate change that they are seeing that are not really any fault of their own. So, it's really important that investment be made in these kind of global challenges in the multilateral system and in development organizations from countries, but also, engagement from the private sector is also really important.
Thank you. So there is one question that was asked very early on that I made a good question. So Francine, given the time, I'm going to ask you this question and ask you if you can give a 30-second response, if that's okay.
All right.
So this question is from Tigist, and forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. And the question is, you mentioned 6 out of 10 people feel insecure. How do we better address this global challenge as UNDP?
Yeah, so it was from a human development report, and 6 out of 7 people around the world, whether you're in a rich country or a poor country, it doesn't matter, feel insecure. So even if our lives in general are healthier, longer, wealthier than ever before, there is this prevalent sense of insecurity. I think the answer, how you address that is by addressing the issues that we've discussed today. I think there is anxiety around climate. There is greater inequality, less understanding between people, rising inequality. These are the kinds of issues that we need to address that feeling of insecurity, particularly amongst young people.
Thank you so much, Francine. This has been a wonderful and insightful conversation. I'm going to hand it back to Alexa, who is going to wrap up today's fireside chat for us.
Thank you, Alia. Wow, what a discussion. That hour just absolutely flew by. Poverty and inequality, elections, gender equality, climate, conflict, and much, much more. Lots of important work ahead. Thank you for all that you do, sincerely. Francine Pickup, Alia Dharssi, our event partner, the UNDP Washington office, and to our members. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope to see you next time. And as a little teaser, our next 2 events will take place the first week of February. On February 6th, we have an event on feminist foreign policy at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It's a breakfast event. And on February 7th, we have a late afternoon evening event at Microsoft, our corporate council member, around tech and global democratic backsliding. We hope to see you there. On behalf of the WFPG and the UNDP Washington office, thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.